Good evening, folks. My name is Johann Bosman. I am one of the ministers here, and on behalf of Christ Community Reformed Church, I want to welcome you and thank you for coming to this very, very important event. It is 7 o'clock, but we are going to wait for another couple of minutes or so because of the accident here. People may still be on their way. Meanwhile, some logistics. The restrooms are down the hallway. Just go straight right to the end, and you will find the restrooms there. In case of an emergency, there is an emergency exit right here, and then, of course, in the back, in case we need them. We don't think we will. We pray we won't, but just for your information. And then we would also like to invite you for some refreshments and fellowship and talking and just being together after the event. And that will be in the hearth room. So when you go out of the sanctuary, there are some good things to eat and to drink. And we invite you to join us in that. We've all been through a trying and challenging time. The pandemic was traumatic, even for those who did not lose family, close friends, or jobs. However, the pandemic has left a mark on us as individuals, as communities, as a country, and as a world. We are very, very fortunate to have a wonderful resource in our area, a resource like the Samaritan Counseling Center, who provides our communities with expert counseling and other services. And I'm very, very grateful this evening to welcome Dr. David Olson, Executive Director, and Kelly Anderson, who is also here tonight to do part of the presentation. And then another colleague, Amy. Sorry about that, Amy. So I want to thank the three of you very much for your willingness to be here, and we are all looking forward to this presentation. So without further ado, Kelly, you are going to be the first one, right?
Hello, can you guys, I'm new to this. I'm Kelly Anderson. You might recognize a face in there. I think we're just going to I want to get started, and I'm using this picture actually as a representation, as when Johann asked us if we would be interested in doing this over the summer. I've been giving it a lot of thought, and I was reminded of times that I spend with Marie. Marie and Johann are also good friends of mine, and I've spent a lot of time with Marie doing various activities, a lot of them outside. This one here was March 5th, 2020, and March 13th sticks in my head. That's the day, the Friday the 13th. I think everybody will remember that Friday the 13th. I remember this picture. We were out for a walk early in the morning. One of our friends who's now in Burlington, she had come to join us. I remember Marie telling us a story. We were talking about different trips we were going to take, kind of loosely talking about what this pandemic that we'd been hearing about. I was planning to go to South Carolina within, I think the end of March with some girlfriends from Seattle, looking forward to that trip. Marie and Johann, I remember, were heading to South Africa, I believe, for an Ironman, shocking, and a wedding, and talking about, that trip, and, I think we're still gonna go, I believe it was within about a week, things changed. So the next, there we go. Fast forward, and I know I'm fast forwarding quite a bit, but this is December 14th, 2020. This is the same group of friends. We're getting together over Zoom. I'm sure many of you would have pictures similar to this of what your get-togethers looked like with your friends. But this was our way of connecting, talking, catching up. We spent very little, if any, time together over the summer as we were all essentially locked into our house, is what that felt like. I thought of this as very representational of the experience of what it was like to feel social and then feel extremely isolated and trying to find ways to connect with our friends. That I look at this picture now and I think, did we really do this? This was us getting together. It seems crazy now as I look back on this and think this was our normal. And I'm sure for many of you, it was the same experience. So as an introduction to what we're going to talk about, I use that, and then I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to talk a little bit more about what we went through, the mental health implications. We want to make it very clear that we welcome engagement. We want to hear from you. We want people to feel comfortable sharing their experiences. We want to have a time for us to talk. I think, if anything, what we've learned is the value of communication and feeling connected to each other is really, really helpful. Feeling validated, even if you didn't lose someone, if you didn't lose a job, you still lost something, and those are really real, and we feel those really deeply. So please, if you have questions, if there's things you want to ask or share, do. There will be an opportunity to talk later as a group, but I'm going to turn it over to you right now, okay?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly, for that intro. To piggyback a little bit on what Kelly just shared with you, I want you to think back just for a few moments on the dates that she mentioned. Middle of March. Think about your experience the day the world closed down, right? Think about that experience. Seems like a while ago, but as Kelly mentioned, we talked about it as a staff meeting. One of our staff has a background in epidemiology, so she has more statistics than any of us need, but she went over all the data. We all thought, this is going to be all right. We'll get through this. I got in my car 2 hours later and drove to Pennsylvania, where I was to lead a pretty large clergy retreat for the Presbytery of Pennsylvania. Drove down, got a bite to eat, checked into my hotel the night before, flipped on the TV to ESPN. Understandably not the most spiritual thing to do, but that's where I went. And as I watched ESPN, the first thing that flashed was they canceled the NCAA basketball tournament. 5 minutes later, they shut down the NBA. A few minutes later, they closed down the hockey league. A few minutes later, all sports shut down. And I vividly remember sitting in that hotel room watching these sportscasters not knowing what to say or do, as literally across the screen, everything we were counting on shut down. They had just started March Madness, right? The major basketball tournament, boom, it all shut down. And I sat in that room thinking, what in the world just happened? I showed up the next morning to about 100 clergy who suddenly didn't know whether they should shake hands, whether they should hug, whether their churches were going to be open on Sunday. And as we tried to get through the material that we were all planning on doing, nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew what to do. But then remember what happened next, right? Try to go back in the timeline and remember what happened. We were told we're going to shut down for what, 2 weeks? Right? It's 2 weeks. Now, I'm surrounded by educators. My wife is a retired guidance counselor. My daughter is an elementary school principal. My son-in-law is a high school teacher. They all said, okay, we're going to take a break for 2 weeks. And you remember we all thought, okay, this isn't good, but we're just going to get through the next couple of weeks. Churches were going to be closed just for a couple of weeks. And then it was a month. And then it was multiple months. And by the end of March, we were saying as a family, well, you know, by mid-April, we'll be able to make that trip we had to Florida. And we thought, we'll get there. But then the airlines all started canceling. The resorts shut down. And little by little, the world closed down. Now, I say that for a reason, which will get clearer in just a moment. But think about the shock to our systems. Going from hearing about this virus, not having too much information, and of course, having it handled politically in a very poor way, right? everything just got worse and worse and worse. And suddenly, we are in uncharted territory. So if you're going to look for inspiration during a time like that, where do you look? I look to Camus, right? Not the best choice. My children think there's something wrong with me because the last time we went to the beach, I bought a book on Kierkegaard, and they thought there was something seriously wrong with me because I didn't bring a novel. But I decided to reread Camus, and I'm going to read this quote because this was written in 1947. If you're not familiar, it's one of the greatest novels of all time. Because in The Plague, he describes a plague that wipes out an entire community. And he says this, "And thus there was always something missing in our lives." Think about that phrase. Think about that Thanksgiving, that Christmas, that New Year's, all the friends you didn't see, all the relatives you didn't see, and thus there was something missing in their life, hostile to the past, impatient to the present, cheated of the future. We were much like those whom men's justice or hatred forced us to live behind bars. It's as if we were imprisoned, right? Now, in the neighborhood that I live in, I pass, in order to get to my house, very nice assisted living facility. What was horrifying, every time I drove past it, was to see families in the winter trying to talk to their loved ones through the windows, right? That was that sort of prison we were all in. Everything was done, as Kelly pointed out, through Zoom. We didn't get to see family. We didn't get to see friends. Everything was complicated. That first year, on Thanksgiving, we had our own little pod, my wife and myself, my son-in-law and daughter and their kids. We planned on at least having Thanksgiving, except my son-in-law got sick. Then we planned on Christmas, and I forget who was quarantined at Christmas. And then we planned on New Year's, and then my son was quarantined. 3 holidays in a row, we did gifts and dinners by Zoom. Now again, most likely that was your experience. So just a quick flashback to that time. Now, from a mental health perspective, what I want to talk about a little bit, and then I don't want this to be death by PowerPoint, so I'd like to get some reactions and some interactions from you. I want to talk a little bit about what happened as the pandemic shifted and developed. I want to talk just for a few moments about 2 kinds of anxiety, right? In the literature on anxiety, they talk about acute anxiety and chronic anxiety, right? Acute anxiety means something shocking happens, right? So picture a flat line, kind of a baseline, right? Then there's a job loss, or a serious illness, or a death, and the anxiety spikes, right? And if you think of an example in your life, you know what that feels like, right? You feel it physiologically, right? Your system goes into overload, right? You're stunned, but what we also know is if you're relatively healthy, that's going to come back to baseline. So acute anxiety is relatively short-lived. Now again, think of COVID. Initially, you saw the news, the world shut down, and there was acute anxiety. We all thought, what in the world are we in for? But we thought it'll be short-lived. We'll come back to normal. Chronic anxiety means it's habitual, it's long-term, and the baseline stays up here. Now think about that. Rather than a line and then a spike, picture a squiggly line like this that keeps going up. What does that tell you? Just brainstorm for a minute. Picture that squiggly line of chronic anxiety. What does that suggest to you? Do you have any thoughts?
Fear.
Fear, yep.
Inner turmoil.
Inner turmoil, yep.
It's never going to end.
It's never going to end. Yep. Uncertainty. That's a big word. Uncertainty. During that period of chronic anxiety, how is your functioning? Is it better or worse? It's worse, right? So here's two things, right? Chronic anxiety, after a while, when it goes long enough, it's your new norm, right? That's what's scary. Acute anxiety, you feel it in your chest, right? A car cuts you off, someone swears at you, your anxiety goes up. But then you come back down, right? Chronic anxiety means it's just up here the whole time, and it's your norm. Except here's the problem. Physiologically, if you're hardwired, your heart rate's up, your blood pressure's up, your skin temperature's up, and your functioning is decreased. Does that make sense? When you're in chronic anxiety, you get a little dumber. Does that make sense? Because your brain is not at its best. Quick example, right? Some of you have had the delightful experience of teaching your kids to drive, right? Is that an anxious experience for most of us, right? So, I teach my kids to drive. My son gets his license first. He says, "Can I take the car out tonight?" And I think, "Yeah, we're proud of you. This is awesome. Great, take the car out." To which he says, to which I say, "And what time should we expect you home?" He says, "Why did I have to be born to the most conservative parents in Niskayuna?" Right? My friends don't have curfews. And this begins an argument about when the car is going to return. We agree on a curfew, sort of. And the curfew comes and goes. And 11:30 turns to 12. You ever been there? 12 turns to 1. Now, in case you're wondering, my wife and I are not sleeping, and I'm not relaxed. And where's my anxiety? Higher and higher and higher, right? Long, sad story short, eventually about 2:15, the garage door opens, and my son walks in like nothing happened. Now, the really good part of the story is I'm a family therapist. So I would know exactly how to advise you to handle a situation like that, right? And so my advice to you would be to say, you know, I'm too agitated and frustrated to have a coherent conversation tonight, so let's both go to bed. Tomorrow, we're going to have a talk. That is not even remotely close to what I said. And I won't repeat it because I'm in a church, and it wasn't pretty. It included such really helpful things like, "You're never going to drive again. I hope you can pick your girlfriend up on your bicycle because that's all you're going to have." My son, who we trained very well to be an amazing attorney because he argued with us from the day he was born, smiled and went, knowing I couldn't hold up anything. Now, what happened? As my anxiety got chronic, where did my functioning go? Down, right? So first thing we want to talk about is one of the effects of the pandemic that Kelly and Amy, I believe, has not gone down actually, is a state of chronic anxiety. Regardless of where you stand politically, how coherent are the debates we're listening to? Right? Not very. How coherent is political discourse? Not very. How much civility is there in our culture at this point? Not a lot. Why? Because the anxiety is still up here. Does that make some sense? Right? So we're starting off by saying, as the pandemic continued, and even as we're sort of coming out of it, although I've talked to 5 or 6 people with COVID in the last 2 days, so we're sort of coming out of it, right? The anxiety level is still up here because the world is uncertain. Now, I want you to play with this quote because it's a fascinating quote, right? It comes from Edwin Friedman's book. He says this: "Chronic anxiety might be compared to the volatile atmosphere of a gas fume-filled room, where any sparking incident could set off conflagration, and where the people would then blame the person who struck the match rather than having tried to disperse the fumes. I'm going to read it one more time, and then we'll try to take it apart. Chronic anxiety might be compared to the volatile atmosphere of a gas fume-filled room, where any sparking incident could set off conflagration, and where people would then blame the person who struck the match rather than having tried to disperse the fumes. What does that quote mean to you? Anybody want to take a shot at it? Yeah, we blame somebody. Yep. And what do we not talk about? I'm sorry? Yeah, right. See, what we don't talk about is we're all hijacked by anxiety. Rather, we blame the one person who acts. Now, who would you suggest that was most of the time during COVID? Pardon me? Spouse, absolutely. Or kids. Yep. So during COVID, I had so many families, and Amy can say the same, Kelly can say the same, so many families that suddenly wanted their kids on meds. Kids were acting out, and they were. But what was happening to kids? Sports were closed. They couldn't go to a playground. They couldn't have play dates. They were learning remotely. Every social opportunity was shut down. So of course, they acted out, because what else are they going to do? But then we blame them as having the problem versus talking about how anxious we all are and trying to soothe it. Does that make sense?
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
And I think if you look at parents trying to adjust, if we're using sticking with the kids, parents trying to adjust and things changing day by day, and that level of chronic anxiety that they're carrying and wondering what's going to happen, and then some small, like fire, if you will, that the kids say, oh, my computer's not working, or oh, I need to do this. Immediately, I think parents, caretakers go to, oh my gosh, I can't take this. I don't have the capacity to help you, not realizing that I'm not mad at my child. I'm mad at this whole thing, and you're just the one that is bringing it out in me. It's not about I need help with the computer or whatever it is that the child is bringing to the parent, but the parent is carrying so much anxiety about the whole system of it and what's going on, and not having any, somebody said uncertainty, and I think that uncertainty of having to, like, I'm focused this way, now I've got to pivot to this way, now I've got to pivot to this way, and then you've got a kid saying, I need this, and just that kid saying, I need this is what lights the fire.
Perfect example. Does that make some sense? See, again, what gets lost during that time period, again, remember, we're a little bit distant from it, but remember what was happening, right? Let's say both parents are working remotely. Kids can't go to school. Everybody's congested now. Any unresolved issues or little conflicts get big because the room is filled with gas, so to speak. Chronic levels of anxiety, right? So that part of the way we're starting this is we're setting the stage by saying that during COVID, on every level, right? Schools, I mean, every teacher that I've talked to in the last couple of years is stressed out of their mind. I said to my daughter, you picked a brilliant time to become a principal, right at the beginning of COVID, right? With decisions being made every day that were crisis level. We're up here. So we're starting with this whole notion that the level of chronic anxiety hasn't actually gone down a whole lot. Does that make sense? Now again, remember what the news was like. Doesn't matter what news you were watching. What flashed on the top of the screen every day? Yeah, every day. This many in the hospital, this many on ventilators, this many deaths. What did that do to your anxiety? Right? Right. We were basically telling people at that time, you got to turn the news off a little bit, right? Because what was happening is that the flashpoints, chronic anxiety, and then we were hearing about kids' problems and schools' problems, right? So that the context for this is this massive chronic anxiety. Now, one more thing, and then I'll give you some depressing statistics, and we'll have some discussion, right? Part of what we know from neuroscience is this thing called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons mean that basically you're engaging in a brain-to-brain hookup all the time without knowing it. Meaning the mirror neurons in your brain mirror back the expressions and the emotions of other people. Simple example. My deeply spiritual ritual every morning is to stop at Starbucks. When I walk in and the person at the counter says, "David, good morning," want the usual, with a smile, what do? Yeah, did I choose the smile? It's automatic, right? That literally there's this hookup that your mirror neurons pick up what the other person is expressing and feeling, right? Now, what happens when you're with anxious people? You catch it, right? Whether you even are aware of it, you're catching their anxiety, right? So if you're sitting in a group and people are anxious, you might have walked into the group relaxed, all of a sudden your chest gets tight, or you get a headache, and you think, what in the world just happened, right? Literally what we found is that that brain-to-brain hookup, or that connection, means we absorb the anxiety. Now again, the news cycle didn't help it, right? The political situation didn't help it. The debates don't help it. So that literally what was happening, especially in the worst of COVID, is we were flooded with anxiety. And that anxiety was incredibly contagious. Does that part make sense? Anybody want to dispute that? Now, I say this for a reason. Because I don't believe that that anxiety has gone down, right? As people get more anxious, how do they act? Not normal, yeah. And so what do? They act out. They become more reactive. They're not thoughtful. They start getting into all kinds of small issues, and any small underlying issues get exacerbated, right? Because what happens is the longer you feel anxious, the more your reserve goes down, and you start to snap at people, right? Now, here's the bad news, right? And we will get to some good news, I promise, right? Bad news. This is data from the Mayo Clinic. December 2020, there was a 30% increase in depression, 33% increase in anxiety. Now, what's curious is only a 14% increase in the Netherlands, 10% in Norway, which would be an interesting thing to play with in terms of cultural differences for how this got handled. But think about those numbers now, right? 30 to 35% increase in anxiety and depression. Where did all that anxiety and depression come from? What's your guess? Why such a spike? Yeah, you have no control, right? Remember at the beginning of it, the big fear was you weren't going to find toilet paper, right? That was like a metaphor, right? That everything was out of control. People were stockpiling toilet paper, fighting each other for it, right? It was insane, right? Because again, the lack of control, what else was fueling this? Isolation, yeah. So, and lack of information, yep. So again, we didn't know. Initially, the data was unclear. It went back and forth, and we were isolated. Part of what we know, go back to the mirror neurons, go back to the way we're wired for connection. What happens when we're disconnected? I spent 2 days last week in Pennsylvania leading a retreat for hospital chaplains. Imagine their stories when they talked about being alone with patients while they were ill and while they were dying. Unable to have family come into the hospital, unable for any social interaction to contain all of that pain. Part of what we know is the greater the isolation, the greater the depression. And so what happened during the heart of COVID is we became more isolated and therefore more depressed because there was no interpersonal soothing, right? Not surprisingly, how did people do in nursing homes during this time? Horrible, right? And ironically, not so much just because of COVID, but because of the isolation of not being able to see family and friends. How many people have you talked to who couldn't visit elderly parents who were dying or ill and were heartbroken that even on a holiday, they couldn't have a simple visit, right? So again, I'm pulling us back now to where we were, but what we want to talk about is the fact that it actually hasn't changed that much. They found, not surprisingly, that social distancing and isolation that resulted produced more anxiety, more depression. Now, back at that time period, and Amy and Kelly remember this, we had to file all kinds of paperwork to stay open, right? You had to qualify, right, as an organization with the state to stay open because you were an essential worker. Guess who else qualified to be an essential worker during COVID? Liquor stores, right? We had to do a ton of work to qualify and submit paperwork. Guess who had a booming business during COVID? Alcohol sales. Not surprisingly, alcohol sales went way up, right? Because it was the one outlet. So the liquor stores, and again, I'm not putting anything down, just an observation, liquor stores did a booming business. And that became everyone's anxiety reduction technique. Yeah, that was their coping strategy, right? So alcohol consumption went up. Now, here's the bad news. Is alcohol a good anxiety reducer? Why? I'm sorry? It contributes to it. Yeah, right. So again, in family systems, we talk about how solutions become the problem. What people forget is that when you have your first couple of glasses of wine, you have that nice, warm, relaxed feeling, right? And so it feels like your anxiety has gone down because alcohol enters the central nervous system as a depressant. It slows us down. Except what we forget is the chemical properties of alcohol turn after 3 or 4 hours into an adjutant. So now it's agitating the central nervous system. And so the only solution is to have another drink or have disruptive sleep. So ironically, the very thing we turned to reduce anxiety was actually increasing it. And not surprisingly, we saw a high level of substance abuse. Right? Obviously, suicide went up. Now, not to keep the depressing stuff going, but for a few more minutes, by 2021, the numbers didn't go down, they went up. Right? So again, remember by 2021, we were turning the corner. But the numbers weren't going where we thought they would go. The numbers grew to 40% for anxiety and depression. And this is from the US Center for Disease Control, right? This isn't stuff we're just making up, right? So that paradoxically, rather than what we'd expect of the numbers slowly coming back down, they kept growing up. Suicide rate climbed 33% over the last 2 decades, and the single biggest population being impacted by suicide right now is who? What's your guess? Kids, right? Kids and teenagers, right? So in the last 2 years, while the national suicide rate didn't change much, it increased for kids. According to the American Psychological Association, 75% of Americans believe that their mental health was impacted by COVID. On top of that, Federal Emergency Hotline saw a 1,000% increase in usage, and 62% of behavioral health organizations, those that provide mental health, by the way, have closed at least one program, right? One of the larger mental health systems in our area is now saying they have almost a 1-year wait list, right? The mental health network has fallen apart. What's your reaction so far to the statistics? What are you thinking? It's grim, right? Is it surprising, though? Right. The thing that we want to highlight, and hopefully as we talk a little bit more, we can highlight it further, is the numbers aren't going down, they're climbing. And so what we're experiencing is an incredible mental health crisis. And that's what we're trying to talk about tonight. A few more statistics. Cleveland Clinic, right? The prestigious hospital in Cleveland. 40% rate of burnout among physicians. If you remember the story during COVID of that brilliant young female physician in New York City, right? Serious athlete, training for a marathon, involved with her church in a study group, great circle of friends, takes her life. Literally burned out by COVID, right? Absorbing all the anxiety. Highest rates, obviously, were in the emergency medicine, primary care, and critical care. 400 physicians die by suicide every year. Clergy statistics, right now, over 50% burnout rate. And during COVID, about 50% said if they could find another job, making the same amount of money, they'd leave the next day, right? Because the stress was over the top. So you don't need my summary, right? Obviously, the demand for services is soaring. Agencies are overwhelmed, and the safety net is broken. Right? Now, what we want to play with a little bit, and I'm going to ask for your help with this, and ask Amy and Kelly as they have ideas to jump in here. I want to talk about the relational impact of COVID. Right? It's one thing to go with statistics, right? It's one thing to talk about numbers of depression and anxiety. But let's talk about 4 specific areas, right? So let's start with what happened to couples during COVID, right? Anybody want to jump in and take a guess at what was going on for a lot of couples? Yes?
It was a lot of conflict because they each had developed a picture of what was going on around them or in their world.
Yes.
And at times they clashed.
That's right.
So it was and as time went on, it was exacerbated by the politics and global issues.
Yep.
And all of that.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely right. Other thoughts?
Well, and throw in if you have different political views during this time with your spouse and what that must be like, and trying to navigate that. You know, it's one thing within a family system, but then if you're, you know, with your spouse, different ideas about how this should be handled, and you have nowhere to go to. It's just the two of you or your family system in that house. That's a hard place to be. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah, how many families had conflict over what their protocols should be during COVID, right? Mask or no mask, get together, not get together, right? My sister is a physician and took it upon herself to call my wife and I to tell us we were crazy because we were getting together with our grandkids, right? everybody had an opinion, right? So that couple function got very intense. Now, play with this. In Bowen's family system therapy, Bowen suggested that every couple has to balance closeness and distance, right? How do you balance closeness and distance? Meaning, one person wants a lot of closeness, they want to talk all the time. The other person is saying, can you just get off my back? I just want to chill. Why do we have to talk so much? Right? They have a balancing act on a good day that balances their different needs, right? How much closeness do you need? How much closeness do I need? How do we balance that? Right? What happened to that balance during COVID?
No time for distance.
Exactly. There was no distance, right? So again, if you remember the beginning of COVID, it's like, okay, now we got to work from home. Everyone's going to work remotely. And a lot of us said, awesome. This will be great. Until it wasn't. Right? Because again, that's a lot of togetherness. Right? Which again, you forget that even in the best of relationships, you get in your car, you drive to work, you go out someplace, you go out for a dinner, something. But all of a sudden there's no place to go. We had just moved to Saratoga as COVID happened, literally that March. Saratoga, if you drive downtown Broadway, you can't find parking. During COVID, what did it look like? Ghost town. It was weird, right? Literally, you could walk downtown and almost nobody was out, and the people that were out were all masked, and nothing was open. So what happened to couples is that as they were locked in together, there was no balance of closeness and distance, which meant that any underlying conflicts that were there on a good day were now on steroids. Does that make sense?
I mean, I'll jump in and share,
Please.
as you're saying this, we worked from home for a bit, and my husband was able to work from home. And it was novel at first, like, oh, we're all at home, we can do this. You take the dining room, the kids are all up in their bedrooms, I will be in a bedroom. And it seemed like a good idea, exactly what you said, until it wasn't. Because my husband's computer is about this big and takes up the entire dining room table. It was just about 2 months ago that it finally went back to work. But it would be the, shh, I'm on a meeting, quiet, everybody be quiet as the dining room's near the kitchen, try to shut the door, quiet, dad's working, he's on a call with India. So it started to find the things that seemed kind of, oh, this is novel and fun, became, this is starting to drive me crazy. Can you go to the basement? Also as like the dungeon, it's not a finished basement. And so he's down there with a blanket and trying to do work meetings down there. So again, what seemed like a good idea at the beginning, and Johan's laughing because he knows my husband, became tolerable, but it became hard. It did become hard, and it wasn't novel anymore.
Right, yeah. Does that make some sense? Again, remember all those little arguments and tensions that arose during that shelter-in-place time. Where do the computers go? What do we do with the kids? Who helps the kids with their homework while they're learning remote, right? One of our colleagues, Erin, had 2 very young children, and both she and her husband are both working remotely. Who helps the kids get on the computer and do their schoolwork? So again, it's a recipe for all kinds of intense conflict building, right? And if there were underlying conflicts, they didn't get better during COVID, right? They mostly got more extenuated, which means coming out of COVID, even though now we're mostly back to work and the world is mostly open, what happened to those issues? Did they get resolved? No. No. Not surprising, rates of domestic violence went way up. Rates of marital dysfunction went up. Because again, as in that image of the gas-filled room, we didn't stop to say, we're actually okay, this is COVID. This is the chronic anxiety. Rather, we started to snap at each other. The more anxious we get, the worse our functioning is. We get more reactive. We snap at each other. And then our pictures of each other shift. Same was true with families. What happened to families during COVID? We just sort of hinted at it with couples, right? But what was happening to the kids?
Well, on the surface, the families were coming together.
Yes.
They were being cloistered.
Yep.
But down a few levels, they were in some ways pulling apart.
Exactly. Right? Because what was happening to the kids, especially the younger ones?
They lost touch with the parents' values and they had no direction.
Yeah. They're bouncing off the walls, right?
There's no socialization.
Yeah. There's no socialization.
I mean, everything is. I hear it a lot. Technology. I just need my kids to get off their devices. And I was just saying to somebody earlier today, we have to remember, like, devices were everything for our kids for a 2.5-year period where that was how they did education. That was how they socialized. That was how they interacted with their friends. That is how they played games. It was all on a device. And so now trying to balance, like, what's healthy device use, what's unhealthy device use is a little tricky.
Yeah. Right. So with kids, we're trying to relearn things, right? Screen time went way up during COVID for good reason, because what in the world else are you going to do, right? They're on their devices, but try getting them off their devices, right? Again, there's a feedback loop in devices. You can get lost in them, right? It was a great babysitting tool until it wasn't, right? I have vivid memories of my young grandchildren destroying our house, practicing gymnastic moves off of the couch, right? Because they didn't know what to do with the energy, right? It's cute for about a half an hour, right? And then it's like, oh my gosh, take it down a notch. But where else were they going to go, right? There's no playground. All the sports they were involved in got lost. Think about what was happening to high school kids. What happened? They lost, right? They lost a solid year. Sports shot, graduations by drive-throughs, proms canceled, dances canceled, everything shut down. I worked with a couple of Division I athletes during that time period who spent all of their high school years training to go to school to play a Division I sport. Guess what they did when they finally got to college? They sat in a dorm room, did their classes remotely, and their entire season was depressed, was lost. So of course, they got depressed, but why? How could they not be depressed? Everything they had worked for is gone, right? So that, again, the other part of this is that the extended family, for the most part, couldn't be present. You couldn't have a large family gathering. You couldn't ship the kids off someplace, right? Because everybody was terrified, right? So that the whole system kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. As a system shrinks, what happens to emotional intensity? Yeah, goes way up because you don't have support, right? Every so often, my daughter will say, "Would you like 2 kids for 3 weeks?" Right? On a normal day, we joke about that stuff, and we can do it some of the time. We can give them a break. We can tell them to take a break. During COVID, there were no breaks. Or there was no extended family. There was no daycare. There were no programs at the Y, right? There was literally nothing. So not surprisingly, think about kids. They suffered. Vivid memory. My grandson started kindergarten during COVID, right as the schools were reopening. And so he's at our house because my wife was going to drive them to their first day of school now that it reopened. And so he's a very outgoing, way too much energy, Precocious, yes. He's going to kill me skiing one of these days because he thinks he's an expert skier. And so he's always telling me, Grampy, we can do a double diamond. I think I kind of have to bring you back alive. But that's his usual energy. First day of school, he's sitting at our table, and I notice he's really uptight. And so I said, Quinny, what's going on, buddy? He said, it's going to be a very long day. And I said, why? I guess it's his first day of kindergarten. He said, I won't be able to eat all day. And I said, what do you mean? He said, they told me I have to wear a mask all day. And if I take it off to eat, I'll get really sick. Right? That's the internalization of a 5-year-old. Right? Now, fortunately, he has a wonderful teacher that helped him with all that. But again, think of what kids were internalizing. They're internalizing this pandemic, but they're also internalizing all of the anxiety of their parents and of their schools and of the system. They're hearing the news too, as much as we try to protect them. They're hearing the stories, right? My grandkids were saying, am I going to get COVID? If I do, what's going to happen? Or, because they're precocious, well, you and Oma are old. What happens if you get COVID, right? Again, all of that is the mind of kids, right? They're taking all of it in, and then all of a sudden we send them back to school, and what's been missing? They lost a year. So right now, the data is pretty frightening, that math scores and reading scores have dropped significantly. But we shouldn't be surprised, right? Because again, the impact has been pretty unbelievable. Now, let's stop for a minute. Where are your thoughts going as you're listening to this? What's going through your mind?
Anyone feel depressed?
Yeah. Yes, right. It's a little depressing, right? What else are you thinking? I'm sorry? Yeah, that's a great question. Is it going to be over? Right? Now we're talking about new variants coming, right? Is it going to be over? What else? The new normal, yeah. Is it the new normal? And I think to some extent it's going to be. This isn't going away for any time soon. What else are you thinking?
I still think, am I taking risks I shouldn't? Like if
Yes.
I don't have to go somewhere, then I shouldn't? Or
Yep. Yep. We think things that we never have thought about before, right? My wife and I just did a brief getaway to Florida last week, and we're in this lovely resort, and all of a sudden we're in an elevator going up to the 18th floor, and the elevator's crowded. And what's my initial reaction? This was a bad idea, right? And nobody has masks on, right? So again, all things we never thought about. Should I do this? Should I do that? Is this restaurant too crowded? Should I get on a plane? Should I get in this elevator? And now what do? Right? Do I shake hands with everybody that wants to shake hands? Right? All of those are questions we never had before.
Well, and I think that speaks to the chronic anxiety
Yes.
or the ambient stress or anxiety that we feel that we're just living with without even realizing that these questions, that's the new normal.
Yep.
And we're not even aware that this is anxiety.
Yeah. Well, for example, little things. There's no such thing as a slight cold right now, right? So that what Amy and Kelly and I wrestle with is, if we get a cold, do you go to work? You test, of course, but if you blow your nose, what happens to everybody around you? They jump way back, right? Again, nothing is normal. So what I'm going to keep highlighting is this chronicity of anxiety that's just hovering, right? And it's everywhere. It's in the schools, I talk to educators every day, and like I said, I'm surrounded by them. Their stress level is through the roof. I talk to clergy. Their stress level is through the roof. I talk to physicians. Their stress level is through the roof, right? Kids aren't always able to put it into words, so what do they do with their stress? They act it out, right? Other thoughts that you have as we talk? Yes?
I'm gonna play devil's advocate.
Good to know.
That's what it's for.
Yeah.
But as you're talking, I'm kind of feeling guilty because my family and I did not experience like COVID. I mean, of course, the deaths and the illness was
Yes.
horrible, but it was like the best time my family
Yeah.
has ever had. It
Yeah.
brought us back together.
Yeah.
It saved us from a time where we were just running nonstop, and I was feeling all that stress and anxiety. So it was a time for us to come down.
Yes.
So I'm kind of feeling guilty that everyone else was really stressed out, and we
Can I say
weren't.
something? Can I
That-
speak to something?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go.
So, and there's data about this, what you said, that there's a Surgeon General's report that was put out last December, which we'll get to, and I think some of the data is in the handouts that you guys have. But one of the things, like it's saying like the difficult things during COVID, but then they said there's actually some positives, and one of the things that he highlighted was some families really thrived with this, that kids who maybe were getting bullied at school, they're back at home. Families who are able to do COVID, if you will, and be at home together, that they had the resources, they were able to isolate together in a supportive environment. It really worked. It brought them closer together. They were able to rally and do that together. So I don't think you're alone in that. I think that, as the data says, like some people really did do well. The other piece about where you feel guilty, and I think it's an interesting point, because for those of us who came through COVID, and we'll talk about this more later, but we came through it, and I say that knowing that we're not done with it, relatively unscathed. So I can speak for myself, like my kids, I have 3 kids. I had at the time when it started, I had a senior, junior in high school in March of 2020, a 9th grader and a 7th grader. They all had computers. They all had their own rooms. My husband had the ability to come home. I had the ability to work from home. I feel like we did relatively okay. And so what do I have to complain about, if you will? Like, I'm okay. But there's little things that I look back on and think, that was really hard. I did okay. I should feel okay, but man, graduation kind of sucked for my kid. Or, wow, there was no prom. That kind of sucked. She was fine with it, but you look back and think, that was a really weird time. So I think it's okay to feel like we did all right. And maybe there was other losses that weren't quite so grand. But I don't think you're alone, if that helps at all, or if that makes sense to you.
And I mean, now I'm experiencing, my children are angry. They're having a harder time now because, they were good, they were happy. And now,
How old are your kids?
almost the same ages as yours. I have a 7th, sophomore in college, and a senior in high school right now, so like now is where, all this anxiety is really high, and so I guess we're kind of ultimately in the same struggle. We just got here at a different time.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate the comment, because that's the dilemma. We all had slightly different experiences. But what got lost is we didn't have much chance to talk about our experiences and sort of learn from each other and support each other. And your comment's also really helpful, and the data supports it, by the way, that for a lot of kids, the anxiety is actually up higher now than it was during COVID, right? That to some extent, while everybody complained about the world closing down, reopening, there's a lot more stressors now. A lot higher expectation, right? There's more going on, right? My grandkids are out every night of the week with either soccer or cycling or whatever sport they're into, trying to fit it all in. They had none of that. It's good news, bad news. What else did you experience during COVID and are still experiencing? Yes?
I had an interesting conversation with a woman who sings with me in a choir. She's a teacher, a math teacher for middle school students, and she says the problem they find in school now is this anxiety, this
Yes.
ambient anxiety
Yes.
that's chronic, and the kids losing the ability to focus on the outside world.
Right.
They've had so much screen time. They're so used to working in here that, like you said, these outside stimuli that come in now and expectations, but then also the inability to focus on that and handle outside things and handle projects and plan their days and handle social situations. She actually also finds it's right now very, very hard during this transition, and she doesn't know sometimes how to help some of these kids. I told her about tonight, but she couldn't be here.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I appreciate that because that's what I'm hearing from educators, that the re-entry has been hard. And whether we call it chronic anxiety or ambient anxiety, we're all carrying it, but we're not acknowledging that we're carrying it, right? That if we are honest with each other about the anxiety and talk about it, it tends to go down. When we repress it and pretend that it's not there, it actually makes our functioning get worse. Does that make sense? Think about if you were ever part of a committee meeting and there's a level of anxiety, but no one's talking about it. How effective is your committee? It's awful, right? Because they don't get anything done. And if you keep pushing ahead, it gets worse. But if you allow everyone to say, we're kind of anxious, let's talk about where everybody is, do a check-in. As the anxiety gets named, there's actually improved functioning, right? That's what we don't want to do. We want to push ahead without naming and normalizing that we're all a bit anxious and that that's okay.
Well, and I think one of the things, like, as we were going through all of these really depressing statistics and the data, and I'm thinking, oh, these people think, it was billed as, how do we thrive? And we're coming in and saying, look at all of this depressing data, which we will get to the thrive part. I want to just make sure that you guys do know we will thrive. But it normalizes for a lot of us when you see that. If you're feeling any of those things, it can be maybe more of a community, like, oh, this makes sense to me. I understand why maybe I'm feeling this way. Just because COVID is over, it's not really over, and people are still being impacted by this ambient stress. I'm carrying this stress with me, and maybe that's why I'm still short with my kids, or maybe that's why I'm arguing with my husband, or I'm having a hard time re-engaging with my family, because I'm still carrying this stress, but so are a lot of other people.
Other experiences that you've had during COVID or that you've been listening to? Yes. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Again, really helpful that if you go into a lot of medical facilities, they actually have signs, don't yell at anybody. Because again, people would take out their frustration. Just getting on an airplane last week, there were all kinds of signs not to yell at the TSA people, right? Not to yell at the people on the airline, right? Because it's out of control, right? Because again, think about anxiety. If you're in a state of somewhat chronic anxiety, you're agitated. Your central nervous system is agitated. And then you look for some place to vent it. So the people that had to go into work all through COVID, they were taking the brunt of this, right? And got hit hard, right? And if you happen to be in a place that was not that enlightened, my sister runs a medical practice in Texas, literally had to go out to Home Depot to get protective gear for her staff because there was nothing available within the hospital system. So the stress levels, right, just going up and up and up, and then people take it out on people. But I was shocked in the airport, both here and on the other end of the flight, how many signs there were about not to yell at people. That speaks volumes. That speaks volumes. What else are you noticing?
Children, teens, they may have their ability to self-soothe
Yes.
was impacted.
Right.
Now, some handled it better than others.
Yep.
Finding things that they enjoyed doing, being turned
Yep.
on finally to things that they discovered that they didn't realize that they could enjoy. So,
Right.
as you're saying, that if we're getting back to this new normal,
Yes.
the paradigm isn't where it used to be.
Right.
It's now in a different place, and so they're adjusting. The kids are having to adjust to shifting to that new paradigm
Yeah.
in their self-soothing techniques.
Yes.
So as adults, we have a difficult time self-soothing because we're impacted by time,
Yep.
circumstances, and the complexity of life. So
Right.
for many of us, it's difficult.
Yes.
But I've been using counseling
Mm-hmm.
myself, and it's been very therapeutic for
Yes.
me,
Yeah.
very helpful.
Yeah.
And
Good.
I would recommend that to
Yep.
anybody. Find
Yeah.
somebody you can talk to
Yes.
that you can trust and talk to.
Yeah.
Because we each have a story.
That's right.
You know,
Yep.
we each have
Absolutely. Well, and you're right. We all have a story, and the stories have to get told, right? That actually is the first step towards self-soothing, right? What you're saying about kids, again, we already talked about this, but how did kids self-soothe during the height of the pandemic? What do they do? Screen time, right? Screen time, right? We have this tiny, tiny little remote that goes with our Apple TV that took me a while to learn to use. My grandson comes in and says, just give it to me. And he goes through all the channels, knows what he wants to watch, because they got very used to screen time, right? As adults, we did too, right? Netflix had a booming business during COVID, right? We all binge watched. I won't tell you my favorite shows that I binge watched during COVID. For those of us in therapy, I don't recommend watching The Patient, by the way. But we binge watched a lot, right? And kids played with devices a lot. Now, all of a sudden, we want them off their devices. We want them back in school. We want them concentrating and involved with other kids. But something got lost, just as it did for adults. Others, yes, Johan.
I love working out and I love reading.
Yes,
And I constantly felt tired
yes,
during COVID and I couldn't concentrate.
yeah,
I felt like I had to read a page 2-3 times before
Yeah.
I really got it. And
yeah,
I shared some of this with others and they said, they
Yeah.
have the same thing.
yes,
Chronic tiredness.
yeah. Yeah, again, really helpful and really common. That things we took for granted, workouts didn't feel the same, and reading was hard, right? You'd find yourself reading the same chapter over and over. Or the infamous, let's just Google this and get the synopsis that's this long, right? Because again, when we're depleted and a little depressed, one of the first things to go is concentration, right? And it tires us out. Everyone I talked to during COVID felt like their energy was down here, right? Because again, all the things we love to do, we're not doing. What builds our energy to some extent is interpersonal connection, which we didn't have a lot of. Other things you observed.
I think that's what I noticed
Yeah.
the most because I personally feel anxiety very somatically in my body. Like my hair will stand on end or my heart will thud. And my kids are ironically wired the same way. And So the amount of spoons to have breakfast, to take a shower, and get dressed for work would cost us two,
Yeah.
and to them,
Yeah.
it cost them the same too.
Right.
And throughout the day, they would get depleted. And I think that
Yeah.
the chronic stress of this
Yeah.
pandemic has robbed us
Yes.
just of some of our spoons.
Yes.
The expectation that we can just bounce back and do what we did and function with the brain power and all
Yeah.
of that, it's just not there.
Right.
Of course, I know all of this. I sing this in sessions. I take David's wonderful views and remember the environment and think we're floating in. It's the pandemic. And then I walk out of 4 or 5 sessions and I'm like, what's the matter with you?
Right. Right. Yeah.
And suddenly we're not eating dinner together. We're like, can it be solo dinner where we all go and eat
Yeah.
by ourselves and watch
Yeah.
Netflix by ourselves?
Yeah.
That's like what it came down to
Yeah.
once a week or so.
Yeah.
But we needed it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So when to
Yeah.
throw in the towel,
Yep.
when to realize that, the trick with anxiety is you can't assess that you're there when you're
Yeah.
up there. So how to
Yeah.
recognize the signs in each other and help
Yes.
each other out. But
Yep.
I mean, it gets us all, and I think that the impact of being exhausted and
Yes.
is just so
Yeah.
profound.
Yeah. Yeah. Really naming the exhaustion and the depletion and recognizing we're slowly coming back, but it's tough. I mean, remember when the vaccines first came out, right? What did we all think? We're through this, right? For many of us, we thought, my wife, myself, my daughter, my son-in-law, my son, we all got appointments. We thought, whew, okay, we're home clear. We can finally go away, we can take a trip. But then what happened to all of that reassurance? Yep, exactly. Yep. And then it just kept coming, right? Then you had to get boosted. Then you had to get this. Then we're hearing variants. So that again, every time we think we're up here, it's like, whew, it comes back down.
It goes to that uncertainty. Again, back
Yes.
to what somebody had said, it's the uncertainty. You think that you've achieved, like we're safe, and then you get knocked down again.
Yeah.
So it's the constant, like that stress that just keeps it up and
Yeah.
down, and there's nothing that feels safe.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you tune in to the theme that we're trying to develop tonight, what would you say is the most important theme so far? Other than all the statistics, which are a bit depressing, what's the most important theme to take away so far? Communication.
We're all in this together.
Yep, we're all in this together.
Give yourself a break.
Yep, give yourself a break. And what's the most important thing we ought to be communicating about?
Our anxiety.
I'm sorry?
Our anxiety.
Our anxiety, yeah. So that as we start to move a little bit towards what should we do, I want to start with 2 simple principles, and then Kelly's got a lot of data that we can play with. Single most important issue is to name the anxiety, to be aware of our anxiety and talk about the anxiety, right? To not do that is to stay in a slight state of hijack, right? Not to bore you with neuroscience, but when we're sitting here in a comfortable place tonight, for the most part, prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, is engaged. If you're driving home and somebody swerves in front of you and you have to jam on the brakes, the prefrontal cortex stops working. The amygdala, the back of the brain, hijacks you. And you only know 2 or 3 ways to cope: fight, flight, or freeze. So when you're in an amygdala hijack, all bets are off. You're not going to think clearly, right? Simple example. Johanna Marie can relate to. I did my first triathlon at age 60, right? I've always was a runner, and I thought, how hard could this thing be? And I thought, I'm pretty sure I know how to swim, because when I was 16, I think I was a lifeguard, so I must know how to swim. And so we go up to a small triathlon. Fortunately, it was a sprint. And they fire the gun, I dive in, and in about 50 yards, I realized, A, I'm not sure I know how to swim. B, I'm experiencing the first panic attack of my life. And C, I think I'm going to drown, right? Full-blown amygdala hijack, right? I couldn't breathe, people were plowing into me, people were swimming on top of me, and I thought, I literally don't know what to do, right? Survived it, but when I finally crawled out of the water, my wife said, I think you should go to the car because you don't look very good right now, right? The anxiety literally drained every ounce of energy out of me, right? Because going into it, I wasn't aware, number one, how anxious I was. When I started feeling it, I didn't identify what it was, and it just got worse and worse and worse, right? One of the things you learn in any sport is to control anxiety. What we forget is that's also the key to living. If we don't name the anxiety, like when my son came home at 2 in the morning, I'll do something dumb. So part of the first most important takeaway tonight is if we're going to get through this, we do it by recognizing that both individually, as couples, as families, we have this ambient stress, this anxiety that's constant. If we name it like you're doing tonight, we talk about it, we remind ourselves we're together in it, it actually goes down. If you fight it, try to block it, or medicate it, it'll go up. Does that make sense? Paradoxically, when we talk about the anxiety to ourselves and to each other, we kind of relax. Right? Sounds paradoxical, but everything we're about to talk about, this is the most important principle. We're in a state of chronic anxiety as couples, families, congregations, schools, and our whole country is in a state of anxiety, right? It's hijacked, right? Civil discourse is shot, right? No matter what you think politically, if you remember the days of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, two of the most opposite characters on the political spectrum. They would debate fiercely on the floor, then they'd go out for drinks, they'd have dinner, they were friends, and they'd hammer out a compromise. As anxiety goes up, that capacity goes down. Everything has become polarized. Families have split over vaccines, over masks, over politics, over what to do with schools. So part of where we're starting is with this whole naming of the anxiety. Do you want to add to that, Kelly?
Well, to piggyback what he's just saying, I think one of the things that strikes me is I've been having a conversation with some friends recently about grief and what is, how do you address grief? And I think to look at the whole COVID experience as a grief experience for many, many, many of us. And one of the things that was highlighted with these friends was we just don't talk about grief enough and the value of talking about it. There's no way to get to the other side of grief, but that you can talk about it, and that is what's soothing, that is what is helpful. And I think when we talk about COVID, the importance of connection, the importance of normalization, the importance of talking, of being able to say to somebody, I'm really struggling, or this is something that I'm having a hard time with. Maybe it doesn't seem like the hardest thing, but for someone to say, I get it, I get it. I mean, Marie, you sent a text the other day talking about being moved to tears because you're singing with people again. And I think we forget what we've lost until we're doing it again, and it can be a profound emotional experience. When you were talking about seeing people at the assisted living, and I have that visual of what it looked like. I would run through an assisted living facility and I would see families outside the windows, and just talking about it now gives me the chills. I think that is something that we just went through. But to be in a community where you can talk about that and other people to say, I remember, I know that was really hard, that connection with other people is helpful. And so I would encourage people, find people to talk to, find people to connect to, find people that you feel safe sharing your experiences with, whether it be in a situation like tonight or whether it's individuals that you have. It is so, so important to have those connections.
To play off of what Kelly said, think of a time in your life, maybe in the last couple of years, where you were really agitated or really anxious or really down. And think of talking to somebody, partner, good friend, therapist, colleague, minister, someone who, when they listened, you felt really got it. They didn't fix it, by the way. They didn't have magic advice for you. But when you talked, they really got it. What happened to your body when they got it? Yeah, literally. If you talk to somebody who really gets it, I mean, they're really listening, you have this experience of whew, something just drops. You feel lighter because somebody got it. There wasn't enough of that during the worst parts of COVID. Hopefully, as we come out, we name that ambient stress, we name that chronicity of anxiety, but we focus on the importance of connection, of really listening and hearing each other, telling our stories, including grief, right? A lot of stuff got lost. Speaking of singing, there was a wonderful editorial in the New York Times back during COVID by an Episcopal priest. It was entitled, "I Miss Singing in Church." And in that beautiful article, she talked about the multiple levels of grief, of all the little things that got lost. So we acknowledge anxiety, we acknowledge grief, but existentially, we also learned a few things during COVID. What are the most important things we might have learned during COVID? Slow down, yep.
Be kind to yourself.
To be kind, absolutely.
Bake bread.
Absolutely.
Kids are resilient.
Yep, kids are resilient. Most of our grief was interpersonal, which tells us that what we learned through COVID and through grief is the things that are perhaps most important are relationship, right? Time with friends, time with extended family, time with colleagues, right? And so one of the things that we learned existentially about COVID is that nothing is guaranteed, right? Planning became sort of obsolete. All of our plans during COVID went down the tubes. Every race I signed up for during COVID got canceled. Every plan I made during COVID got shot, right? All my wonderful thoughts about what I was going to do for the next year went down the tubes. But paradoxically, we also learned what's important: relationship, family, and how do we invest our time, right? Now, you've got a bunch more slides. We want to go through those now?
We can. I think I just wanted to highlight a couple things on
sure.
here. I think when folks are looking for how do we thrive, one thing that I was struck by, Marie, I think you said the baking of the bread. People
Yes.
during COVID were like looking for the things to do. Like, what can I do? I'm going to knit. I'm going to quilt. I'm going to bake bread. It's great. A lot of people have now abandoned those great hobbies then. I would encourage you, if you were someone who did those things, if you're looking for ways to feel better, revisit those things.
Yeah.
A lot of people just have stopped doing it. I think the practice self-care, those are things that I think people really like to look, like, how do I feel better? I think it's in the handouts, but those are all helpful. Be aware of ambient stress, exercise. People don't like to hear exercise, but it does, it's a reset. It does, even if you get outside, I say to people, if you don't want to go outside, that's fine. Give yourself 5 minutes. If you go out for a 5-minute walk and after 5 minutes you want to come back in, that's fine, but you've done it. Most of the time, you get out and for 5 minutes, you're like, this isn't so bad. It's getting your feet on the floor and out the door is the hardest part, and then you'll feel better. And I think it is a reset for your body. Spiritual practice, mindfulness, prayer, meditation, yoga, worship, nutrition. Poor nutrition increases anxiety. As David said, alcohol is a poor anxiety drug. Find time for unstructured play without an end result, to just be, to not be having to check a box or do something, but going back to like, what fills me with joy? What do I enjoy doing? Reduce exposures to stressors. We talked about this earlier. If watching a newsreel for 24 hours a day feels stressful, pay attention to that. I use the term saturated. It's good to be informed. It's bad to be saturated. If you're finding yourself that it's creating a physical response as you turn on the news first thing in the morning or you turn it on when you go home, shut it off. There's ways that you'll find out, and I think that constant exposure just ups our anxiety levels. So be mindful about that and reduce your exposure. Get into nature. It seems so simple, but it is the simple things. Go outside, go for a walk. Photography. This time of year right now, I had a client walk in and she just stops at the bottom of our stairs by your office. There's a window there and the tree is just bright yellow. It's a maple. She's like, look at that. That's beautiful. And we forget because we take it for granted. It is beautiful, but to take a moment to really appreciate that, but it's a reset for our nervous system. And finding ways to give back. I think right now people are feeling super overwhelmed. I'll speak for myself. I feel super overwhelmed with all of the things that are happening in addition to COVID. There's lots of hard things that are happening right now. And you turn and you think, where do I start? I can't go to Ukraine. Like I've got a family. I can't do that. I can't go march someplace. But you can find ways within your community to give back something, or whether it's time or money. It helps because you're doing something of value to your community or for your community. And it makes you feel like you're moving in the direction that you want to go. So maybe I can't go to Ukraine, but yeah, I can put together some goodie bags, or I can volunteer for a local shelter in town, and then you feel like you're part of a community, which is helpful. Back to the community piece.
Let me just highlight two or three things that Kelly just said. Anxiety is physiological as much as it's psychological. So think about that. Anxiety is physiological as much as it's psychological, which means it's not in your head, it's in your body. So if you think about many of the things Kelly just referenced, exercise, movement, walking, yoga, meditation, all of that is a way to get it out of your body, right? Just not moving when you're anxious, sitting still too long, the anxiety always gets worse, right? So literally, movement and spiritual practice. If you watch what happens if you do meditation or some kind of centering prayer, your heart rate will come down, your stress level will come down, and you'll notice literally a physiological change. Yoga does much the same thing. So think about that as you play with this chronic stress. It's not just in your head. It's not a psychological problem, so to speak. It's physiological. And the medical establishment will verify that with all their markers.
Do you guys know who Sanjay Gupta is? I think he's a contributor on CNN. A couple of years ago, I was listening to a podcast that he did, and it was at the beginning stages of COVID, I believe, and he was talking about good brain health, good mental health, and telling these stories. And he was thinking, oh, I've got to do like the crossword puzzles and the Sudoku, whatever that is, and then he did more research, and what it was found that had the best impact on improved mental brain health was going for a brisk walk with a friend. And he said, it seems so easy because it's a walk. He said, if I've got, I know I have to go for a run at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I see like that's going to be really good for my body. I got to go do that. And so it's not going to get pulled off the calendar, but a walk, like that, what benefit does that have? But the research showed you move your body quickly and you have a meaningful conversation with a friend. You finish that experience, if you want to call it an experience, and you feel better. Your brain feels better, your body feels better, because it's addressing, as you said, both the physiological and the psychological impact of the anxiety.
Just remind my wife that when she walks with me,
Not
it's not helpful for her to keep saying, "Can you please walk faster?" Right, right.
Do people have questions, comments, experiences that they want to share about what it's been like? I mean, we're now almost 3 years in, and I mean, when Johan texted me a couple weeks ago and said, I can't get together, I've got COVID, like, oh, okay, yep, we've still got COVID. But it's, if you have experiences that you guys want to share or questions, please feel free.
I just have an observation. I think it's interesting to me that we are now talking about this and learning that we should talk to each other about our COVID experiences.
Yes.
I don't personally think we've done much of that.
Right.
Because I don't want to talk to people. I feel, why would I talk about COVID? It's so bad. It's, we all know what we went through. Why rehash that? Let's move forward. Let's, get the world going again. But I almost think we are arriving now at this point in the transition beyond the worst of the pandemic, let's put it that way, where we have to learn to talk about how we feel and what happened to us and share those experiences without feeling that we're boring our friends,
Right.
but also then listening to them, and that'll help us actually move forward. And I haven't thought of it that way. I thought just ignore this whole thing, move on, and it'll go away on its own. But I don't think that's the solution.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound to me like the right thing.
Yeah.
But I think many of us are coping that way.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful, Marie, because the research on trauma says people try to cope by trauma by getting past it. What we know about trauma is the only way to get past it is to talk about it, and literally to relive it in the presence of someone that's nurturing and empathic. COVID was a kind of trauma, right? It traumatized our country, our families. We get past it only by sharing our stories with each other, because that builds community and connection. Other observations? Yes?
It's like an AA meeting.
Yep.
My name's John, and I was scared during COVID.
Yeah, right. Well put. Yep, well put.
A lot of people don't want to expose themselves
Yep.
to opening their heart in a manner that
Yes.
allows other people in.
Right. Yeah.
Closed and private people, and I can respect that.
Yes.
Only time will tell how they evolve in their
Yes.
coping strategies.
Right. Exactly.
But collectively, I think I've had many experiences over the past several years that have led me to believe that being open and honest and
Yes.
finding a group that you would settle in with or a counselor that
Yes.
you talk to
Yeah.
regularly
Yeah.
is very beneficial.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Same goes for kids. Letting them talk. Yes.
Well, I was going to mention the kids, and I agree with Marie. Before tonight, I never did think about talking about COVID with my children and the
Yeah.
damage that it did to them.
Yes.
Assessing the damage of children that are 2.5 years into this.
Yep.
And at the time were 16 and 18, they're now, older adults. And when I think of what their narrative must be of what they lost and their
Yeah.
disappointments, and now
Yeah.
they're dealing with anxiety, which I didn't see coming at all.
Yeah.
Because I helped work over it.
Yes.
But obviously, they were wound pretty tight to survive
Yeah.
all this. And now the ambient stress,
Yes.
it's just coming out in ways me as a parent had no idea.
Yeah.
So I am really thankful for that
Absolutely. That and groups for kids where they can normalize. Again, like I think of my grandson, he thought it's normal to go to school with a mask because he never had any other experience. His whole first year was wearing a mask to school. That's all he knows, right? So again, allowing kids to have some chance to talk about it. The reason we started with the depressing statistics is only to illustrate this isn't getting better, right? The data for kids is actually getting worse, not better. And part of that is because of, as you just said, our assumption is, well, we're getting past it. Why go backwards? Well, we're going backwards because they still have to process what they went through.
It's like PTSD.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's also, at the same time that it's a critical time to be talking about it, we've lost the skill to communicate and talk. I work in a conflict resolution organization, and the schools, when they came back, they were saying it was like dead silent in the cafeteria.
Yes.
At the beginning, kids didn't, they lost the ability to chit chat and talk with each other.
Right.
And I think adults too are, you know, like, work in a networking, you know, session, and now everybody's like, I don't know how to talk to anybody anymore.
Yeah.
So there's this hesitancy to even engage and communicate at the very time that we should be connecting.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
An example of how difficult it is for kids to find that language, or for us to, like, when you're chronically stressed, you lose sight of everything you've always known, you can't access what works, and we talked openly because I had the gift of early in the pandemic having this presented to us as a therapist, as the reminder of, you know, the tank we're all floating in.
Yeah.
And it was so helpful. So I did talk to my kids about it a lot. And just recently, my son had COVID, and we were treating it like the cold it was, basically.
Yeah.
It didn't kick off. And 2 weeks later, he told me, I was so terrified
Yeah.
that if I gave this to you or daddy, that you would die.
Yeah.
And I
Yep.
mean, it wasn't the
Yeah.
COVID of 2.5 years ago,
Right.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, we could all
Yeah.
had different versions of it since then, but like he just carried that kind of trauma.
Yeah.
You know, in the news, it
Yep.
was all over. The kids are carrying it. The kids are
Yeah.
sick. You know, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So I just thought
That's such a great example, Amy, because again, you treated it like a cold. Experience was something very different. And that's what we forget, the internalization that kids make, we're not necessarily aware of where they're going with it. Other thoughts?
I appreciate that you emphasize that it's physiological as well
Yes.
as psychological. My husband was carrying that anxiety and it was affecting his health, but
Yes.
he kept saying, well, it's not all, you know, I just trying to tell him this. He's like, it's not all, I'm not going crazy.
Right.
It's not all in my head. No, it's not all in your head. You are physically, you know, having effects of your anxiety. You need to,
Yeah.
like, you need to deal with it.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't think kids realize that
Nope.
anxiety has physical effects.
Right.
So,
Well,
meaning that I think is
yes. Yeah, as a culture, we don't talk about the physiology of anxiety. We treat it like a psychological issue, and it's partially psychological, but there's a physiological component, and again, the contagion of anxiety is horrific. So that when you're around an anxious group, or an anxious culture, or an anxious school, you're going to catch it. And then you're going to wonder why you're exhausted, or why you're depleted, because literally you're absorbing it, right? And then physiologically you're wiped out. And unfortunately we haven't talked about that enough during COVID. Want to just skim the slides?
Yeah. So, is my head in the way if I am?
You're good.
Okay. You're in my way.
I'll get out of your way. Sorry, I'll move.
So I spoke earlier about the Surgeon General's report. It's an advisory on youth mental health, which was released in December of 2021. And so this focus of this is really all about the kids. And I think Johan had said, I just want to make sure we address the kids, because there's a group, and you guys have said it tonight, like that's a group that we are seeing now has really been impacted. So the Surgeon General, and I wanted you guys have this information. This is just a small bit of it. I think it's like a 50-page report. It's laid out really well. It's really readable. So if you want more information, this is just a small piece of it. But this report was released. It outlines the policy, institutional, and individual changes needed to address challenges, strengthen the resilience of young people, support families and communities, and mitigate the pandemic's mental health impacts. Okay, hate to do this to you guys, but first the bad news. The research showed mental health challenges before the pandemic were the leading cause of disability and poor life outcomes, with nearly 1 in 5 children between the ages of 3 and 17 in the United States with a reported mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorder. In 2016, about half of the 7.7 million children with treatable mental health disorders did not receive treatment. Between 2009 and 2019, national youth surveys showed a 40% increase of high school students reporting persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. Thoughts of suicide in the same group increased by 36%.
Just let that sink in for a second. 36% increase in suicidal ideation.
Psychiatric emergency room visits for youths increased by 28% between 2011 and 2015. And this is pre-pandemic. So it goes, well, I'm going to say it goes without saying, but we have a mental health crisis in this country before the pandemic even started. National Center for Health Statistics reported more than 6,600 deaths by suicide in kids between 10 and 24 in 2020. COVID has drastically changed kids' lives at home, at school, and in the communities. There's a pervasive sense of uncertainty and fear, loss of big and small moments, which is stuff that we discussed earlier. Racial and ethnic minorities and marginalized populations have been disproportionately impacted, with higher rates of grief and loss of COVID, of hardships, food, housing, insecurity, unemployment. 76% of LGBTQ plus students reported persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness, with limited access to support during COVID. That really resonated with me, because you think of kids who are already struggling and where are they going for support. They might have a guidance counselor at school. They might have support groups at school. All of a sudden, those don't exist anymore. If they don't have parents who are supportive, they're at home, in lockdown, in an unsupportive environment. That's scary. 80% of Asian Americans experienced, oh, there's another typo, sorry guys, COVID discrimination in person or online. As a reminder, this is where Asian Americans were being blamed for COVID. There was the incident down in Atlanta, Georgia, with the mass shooting at a nail salon. Yeah. So Asian Americans, some of the research, and they were feeling responsible for COVID, or being made to feel responsible. Pandemic research covering 80,000 youth globally found depressive and anxiety symptoms doubled during the pandemic. Estimated that out of June of 2021, so a little over a year ago, more than 140,000 US children had lost a parent or a grandparent caregiver to COVID. There is some good news. There it is. So as I mentioned earlier, some young people thrived during the pandemic. More sleep, more quality time with family. My kids were thrilled. They were in pajamas all the time. Less academic stress, less bullying. Some measures of well-being, such as rates of life satisfaction, remained relatively unchanged throughout the first year of the pandemic. Young people are resilient, we spoke of that earlier, and able to bounce back from difficult experiences. And this is great. Many people recognize the need to support youth mental health during COVID and got involved. You look at how quickly healthcare pivoted to telehealth, mental health pivoted to telehealth. What can we do to support kids? I know in my school district, the meals that were getting delivered, or where you can pick up meals for kids who are on meal programs, to make sure that that was not impacted. It was great to see people get involved. So what's next? we need to take action, and it's an all hands on deck approach. I'm just highlighting a couple of areas, the young people and what families can do, but there's also areas about what can schools do, what can communities do. So for young people, remember that mental health challenges are real and treatable, shaped by several factors, including life experiences and biology. Ask for help. Find a trusted adult that you can connect with. So I say to my kids, look, if you don't want to talk to me, that's fine, but find somebody that you feel comfortable talking to. That's okay with me. If you want to talk to your grandmother, great. If you want to talk to your grandfather, great. If you want to talk to your aunt, fantastic. Our friend Tracy across the street, fantastic. Because I know that they're talking to somebody that I trust and that they trust. Invest in healthy relationships. Find ways to serve. Helping others when you're struggling can feel counterintuitive, but it's an antidote to isolation. Again, it goes to community, it goes to connection. It just might feel hard when all you want to do is stay in bed, and we're saying go out and get involved, and like, I don't want to get involved, I just want to stay in bed. Learn and implement practical and healthy techniques to manage stress. Be mindful of social media use, that's a biggie. Engage in offline interactions, take care of your physical and mental health, avoid substances which can exacerbate depressive symptoms, stuff that we talked about earlier. Social media, I say this a lot to kids, I say it a lot, I work with a lot of postpartum patients. Social media can be great, but it can be deadly. It can bring people down. You know, the Facebook post of look how great my life is makes people feel more anxious because what they're seeing is an image of what their life should look like. Kids get involved in that, kids see that and think, why is my life not like that? What am I doing wrong? And they just spiral. So I try to encourage kids and adults, reduce your social media use, don't be on all of the time. That's not reality, that's fictitious. What can family members and caregivers do? Model good physical and mental health. Talk about mental health, talk about physical health. Show them, you know, if you're seeing a therapist, tell them, I see a therapist, no big deal. My kids talk about therapy with their friends. I've gotten so many referrals from their sports teams to like get connected. I love it. I love that they come into my house and tell me about their therapist. This is something that didn't exist when I was in school. I don't know if this, very different time.
Very.
Help children develop strong relationships with adults. Research shows, and I've highlighted this, that the most important thing a child needs to be resilient is a stable, committed relationship with an adult. Work to provide a stable and predictable home life. Kids crave structure and routine. They want to know what to expect. Be attentive to your kids' or your children's online presence. Technology has opened the door for increased mental health opportunities. Think telehealth, connection with friends and family. But kids are potentially opening themselves up to negative online experience, bullying. Look for warning signs and seek help when needed. Don't be afraid to reach out for help if you have concerns. It's better to err on the side of overly cautious than not cautious enough. And that's questions. As I said, there's a lot more data. If you go to the website, it's very readable. I just wanted to highlight some of the stuff, but it's a great report that's very informative.
Just think for a moment, though, when do you ever remember the Surgeon General putting together a comprehensive report that focused on kids? That speaks volumes, right? The fact that the Surgeon General put together such a comprehensive report, again, speaks to the level of crisis. We've covered a ton of material. Final thoughts, final questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Yes.
This isn't based on anything, so that's the reason I'm asking the question. My inclination is that kids that were homeschooled, they cope differently. And I just wonder if there's any data that supports that. And if they cope better overall, is there something that that community does that the rest of us should be emulating?
I don't know the data other than anecdotal data. I think homeschooled kids did better during COVID because they were used to being homeschooled, right? so that in that sense, they weren't faced with the shock value of moving from a classroom to being homeschooled.
Well, it had the structure and routine.
Yeah.
We talk about it. They
Yeah.
already had structure and routine because they knew what to expect because this was no change to the normal day,
Right.
if you will.
The challenge of the homeschool community, though, is increasing the social interaction. So the ones that do it well are part of large groups, co-ops, yeah, where there's a lot of social interaction. Otherwise, the danger is if you don't have that interaction, how do you cope in college when you're thrust into an environment where there's a lot of social interactions? But we do know, anecdotally at least, that the homeschool kids had very little adjustment during COVID because they had the structure in place, and they did very well.
Their teachers were probably a lot mellower too.
Yeah, right.
Because
Yes.
they're used to doing that. That was their
Yes.
role already. Whereas, parents that were working full time, pivoting to
Right.
to working on,
Yeah.
on screens and then
Yeah.
having to, figure out how to do kindergarten on it, with a little
Yeah.
peanut.
Right.
The clients that I had that were in that full time work
Yes.
and full time teacher juggle, it just fried them.
Yeah.
Did you have any personal experience with homeschooling or anyone that you knew?
No,
You were just
it's
curious?
just that a lot of the things that you mentioned
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
it made me think of homeschooling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, we have friends in homeschool that
Mhm.
they're grown,
Yep.
but that's what made the question
Yeah.
pop. I
Yes.
do want to tell you, you were not alone.
Mm-hmm.
You were not alone. I mean,
Yep.
we were fortunate. I mean, our children were grown at the time.
Yes.
We didn't have there's a lot of good things that came out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay? I mean, our kids call us 3-4 times a week now. We didn't
Yes.
hear from them for 2-3 weeks before.
Yeah. Yep.
That type of thing.
Yep. That's great.
I think now, though, as a society, we're feeling the after effects of this residual anxiety.
Yes.
You call it acting out.
Yep.
But we're acting out in ways that affect a bunch of people.
That's right.
We act out with guns, we act out with tanks,
Yep.
with missiles.
Yep.
I don't know how this group can do things to affect that on a global scale. But we can certainly do it in our local.
Yes. Again, not to keep quoting Murray Bowen, the grandfather of family therapy, but he talked about a concept called societal regression, when the level of chronic anxiety catches up to a culture, the culture becomes regressive and begins going backwards. I think there's no denying that's where we are, that the whole sense of chronic anxiety, not just family-wise or school-wise, but the massive cultural shift, the level of reactivity, the level of lack of civility, the level of violence is through the roof. That's all a result of this unresolved chronic anxiety that just keeps getting worse. And I think locally, we maybe can't affect the world, but we can affect things locally. And community, dialogue, discussion, sharing calms things down, right? It's hard to be really upset with somebody when you sit with them and have coffee and try to understand their perspective, right? One of the greatest examples of civility, NPR talked about this, was they took a group of radical pro-choice activists with a group of equally radical pro-life activists. And they said, we're going to put you in a room for 3 hours. Sounds dangerous. With a facilitator. We're very clear no one's going to change their mind on their position. But what we'd like you to do is come out of that room with a healthy respect for how the other people arrived at their decision. It's an amazing piece of data because after 3 hours, with the help of a really good facilitator, these people came out in tears, hugging each other. They became friends. No one changed their position, but they appreciated how the other people arrived at theirs. That's the level of civility that we can get to if we can contain anxiety, and we're a long way from that. Yes?
I think we really need to emphasize
Yes.
flexibility.
Yes.
You know, people are, I have to do this and I have to do
Yeah.
that and I have to do this. Well,
Right.
what if that falls through?
Yes.
And I always say, okay, well, if that doesn't work, then let's do a
Mhm.
plan B.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
what could be a potential, you know, side road to
Yeah.
do that? And,
Yeah.
you know, I find that to be helpful for people to kind of understand that.
Well, you're exactly right. Some of the research on mental health says the greatest predictor of mental health is the capacity for adaptation, to keep shifting, to keep adapting, as opposed to being rigid. Yes.
I guess I'm not sure, I'm not very good at words, but put all this stress together, people need to get back together.
Yes.
And today we're sitting right in the house of worship, God's house. The big, all the world, all the United States, pushback for not going back to church is very, very, very strong.
Yes.
Is there any way that can be changed, or can we look at it differently, or because it's sad to see house of worship with 15, 20 people,
Mm-hmm.
where I saw one time there was a couple hundred or more.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to a really important issue that I know all clergy are wrestling with. Post-COVID, about 30% of people didn't go back across the board, which to me is incredibly dangerous. I think the adaptability of online worship and all that is great, but it's not the same as sitting with somebody. It's not the same as having a cup of coffee with somebody. It's not the same as singing with somebody or sharing pain. And I think that's some of the danger of the adaptation is if we move away from community, we've lost something very, very important, right? The online stuff, I'm not negating it at all. It was a necessary adaptation. But I think it's Martin Marty's son, who writes from the Christian Century, is talking a lot about this right now. The loss of community is deadly, right? Because everything we've just been talking about is saying the antidote to stress and chronic anxiety is quality community, where we sing together, where we share our pain together, where we grieve together, and where we laugh together. That's the antidote to this chronic anxiety. Online stuff can't quite replicate that.
Isn't this the church, the center of the whole thing, the starting point to help bring it all back together? Or am I just...
We're hoping. We're hoping. We're hoping. Well, you know, it's so interesting. In church history, during the Great Plagues in Europe, the churches stayed put and became a refuge for people dying. So if you look at the history of plagues, the church has always had a central role. And I think it could have a very central role in the healing of this culture with chronic anxiety.
Thank you very much. This was immensely helpful to me, and I'm very sure it was helpful to you too. Our species, I could think of two things about our species. One is that we're extremely vulnerable. The other, we're extremely resilient. So if we can try to do something is to be in touch with our own humanity and be gentle and kind to the humanity of others. Let us be gentle, let us be compassionate, and let us be kind. And let us have some refreshments after this. Thank you for coming, and once again, thank you so very much.